The moment my son Stephen walked into my hospital room and announced he'd sold our family farm behind my back was the moment I realized I'd raised a vulture instead of a child. "You're dying anyway, Mom," he said, pulling out his phone to show me some real estate document like he was sharing vacation photos. "So, I figured I'd get the money now instead of waiting for probate." That's when I smiled and delivered the words that would haunt him for weeks. "Too bad you didn't wait, sweetheart. You would have inherited the farm and everything I had buried in the backyard." If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me take you back to how we got here because Stephen's betrayal didn't happen overnight. It was years in the making and I was too blind to see it coming. 3 weeks ago, I collapsed in my kitchen while making Sunday dinner. The pain in my abdomen was so fierce I thought I was being split in half. Stephen found me there an hour later, curled up on the linoleum floor like a wounded animal. Instead of panic or concern, his first words were about the mess I'd made when the soup pot fell. At Kansas City General, Dr. Morrison delivered what we thought was a death sentence. Pancreatic cancer stage 4, maybe 6 months if I was lucky. Stephen's reaction was telling. Not tears or questions about treatment options, but an immediate inquiry about my will and whether all the paperwork was in order. The family farm had been in the Thompson name for 4 generations. My great-grandfather had claimed those 150 acres in 1889, and every Thompson since had worked that land with their own hands. When Stephen was little, he'd follow me around the property like a devoted puppy, collecting eggs, feeding chickens, learning the rhythms of farm life. I thought he loved it as much as I did. But somewhere between his 18th birthday and his expensive college degree, Stephen decided farming was beneath him. He'd returned for holidays with his perfectly manicured wife Jessica, their twin boys in their designer clothes, all of them treating my home like some quaint museum they were obligated to visit. "When are you going to sell this place and move somewhere civilized?" Jessica would ask, wrinkling her nose at the smell of fresh hay. Stephen would laugh and change the subject, but I caught the calculating looks he'd give the property like he was already mentally dividing it up into dollar signs. Now lying in this sterile hospital bed with machines beeping around me, I understood that he'd been planning this moment for years. The concerned son acted the offers to help manage my affairs. It had all been preparation for this theft, but Stephen had made one critical error. He assumed I was helpless, confused, ready to fade away quietly. He had no idea that behind my grandmotherly facade lived a woman who'd survived the Depression, raised a family alone after my husband died, and successfully managed a working farm for 40 years. The fool also had no idea what I'd actually buried in that backyard. The day I buried my secrets, Stephen was 12 years old and convinced he was going to be a famous baseball player. He spent that entire summer of 1995 in the backyard practicing his swing against the old oak tree, completely oblivious to his mother digging holes in the moonlight like some deranged gardener. My husband, Robert, had died that spring. Sudden heart attack while fixing the barn roof. At 46, I found myself alone with a grieving child and a mountain of debt Robert had hidden from me. The farm was mortgaged to the hilt. Creditors were circling like buzzards, and Stephen's college fund had mysteriously vanished into Robert's failed business ventures. But Robert, bless his secretive heart, had left me one final gift. A safety deposit box I knew nothing about, containing information that would change everything. Insurance policies I'd never seen, old documents, and most importantly, a letter explaining why our seemingly poor dirt farm was actually sitting on something valuable. The mineral rights Maggie. His letter read in that familiar scroll. Granddad Thompson knew what he was doing when he bought this land. The oil company's been sniffing around for decades, but I kept saying no. If something happens to me, don't let them lowball you. That land is worth millions. He was right. Within 6 months of his death, Petroleum Solutions Incorporated came knocking with an offer that made my head spin. Not to buy the land but to lease the mineral rights for oil drilling. The signing bonus alone was enough to pay off every debt and fund Stephen's entire education. But here's the thing about sudden wealth. It makes you paranoid. I'd seen too many farm families torn apart by money, children fighting over inheritances, marriages destroyed by greed. I decided Stephen would inherit the farm naturally when I died. But the money needed protection from everyone, including my own son. So I did what any sensible farm woman would do. I converted everything to cash and precious metals, put it all in waterproof containers, and buried it strategically around the property. Different spots, different depths, some marked only by coordinates I memorized. I told myself it was an emergency fund, protection against economic collapse, a guarantee that Stephen would always have something to fall back on. I never imagined I'd need protection from Stephen himself. Over the years, I added to my buried treasure the yearly mineral rights payments, money from selling crops, even my Social Security checks. I kept enough for expenses and buried the rest. Stephen never questioned why I lived so modestly or why I claimed to be land rich but cash poor. He was too busy with his important city life to care about his mother's finances. By 2020, when the oil company negotiated a new lease agreement, my backyard contained more wealth than most people see in a lifetime. Stephen still brought his family for obligatory visits. Still made jokes about Mom's old-fashioned ways, never knowing he was playing frisbee over a fortune. The irony wasn't lost on me. Stephen had sold the farm to get his hands on what he thought was my entire estate, maybe $50,000 in savings and an old house. If he'd shown even a shred of patience or human decency, he would have inherited millions. Instead, his greed had cost him everything. Lying in my hospital bed, watching his face cycle through confusion, fear, and desperate calculation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Perfect crystalline satisfaction. Stephen thought he was so clever, manipulating a dying old woman. Too bad he had no idea this dying old woman had been playing chess while he was still learning checkers. Dr. Morrison's face was flushed with embarrassment when he walked into my room the next morning. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to apologize," he began, and I knew immediately that my world was about to flip upside down again. "The lab mixed up your results with another patient. You don't have pancreatic cancer." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. "Excuse me? You have a severe abdominal infection that's been masquerading as something much worse. It's completely treatable with antibiotics. You'll be going home in a few days, and with proper treatment, you should make a full recovery." I stared at him, processing this information while my mind raced through the implications. I wasn't dying. Stephen had sold our family farm based on false information, and somewhere in his panicked greed, he just signed away his birthright for pennies on the dollar. The doctor continued explaining about infections and treatment protocols, but I'd stopped listening. Instead, I was calculating. Stephen thought he'd pulled off the perfect crime, stealing from a dying woman who'd be too dead to complain. But now I was very much alive, very much angry, and very much interested in teaching my son a lesson about consequences. After Dr. Morrison left, I reached for my phone and did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I called a lawyer, not our old family attorney who'd helped Robert with farm business, but a sharp litigation firm in Kansas City that specialized in exactly the kind of problem I now faced. "Hawthorne and Associates, how may I help you?" "I need to speak with someone about fraud and elder abuse," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "My son sold my property without my knowledge or consent while I was hospitalized." Within 3 hours, Miranda Hawthorne herself was sitting beside my hospital bed with a legal pad and a recording device, tall, severe, and wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. She listened to my story with the kind of focused intensity that made me understand why she had a reputation for destroying people in court. "This is straightforward fraud," she said when I finished. "Your son forged your signature on legal documents while you were medically incapacitated. We can have the sale reversed and pursue criminal charges." "How long will that take?" "Months, possibly years. These things move slowly through the courts." I shook my head. "I want something faster, more direct." Miranda raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mrs. Thompson?" "I'm suggesting that Stephen believes I'm dying and that he's gotten away with theft. I'd like to keep him believing that for a while longer, at least until I figure out exactly how much damage he's done and how much justice he deserves." "You want to let him think he's won?" "I want to let him dig his hole deeper. Men like Stephen don't stop at one crime. They get cocky and commit more. And the deeper he digs, the harder he'll fall when the truth comes out." Miranda smiled for the first time since entering my room. "Mrs. Thompson, I think we're going to work very well together." That evening, Stephen called to check on my final arrangements. His voice oozed fake concern, but I could hear the excitement underneath. He'd probably already spent his blood money in his head, planning the vacation he'd take or the new car he'd buy. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Tired, I said, letting my voice sound weak and defeated. The doctors say it won't be much longer. I'm sorry this is so hard, but I'll take care of everything. The farm sale is all finalized, so you don't have to worry about any of that paperwork. The sheer audacity took my breath away. He was actually presenting his theft as a kindness, like he'd done me a favor by stealing my property. That's good, honey. I'm glad you're handling things. Try to rest. Mom, I'll see you soon. After he hung up, I lay in the dark planning. Stephen thought he was dealing with a helpless old woman on her deathbed. He had no idea he just declared war on someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Tomorrow, I'd be discharged to what Stephen believed would be my final days. But instead of preparing for death, I'd be preparing for the most satisfying revenge of my life. The best part? Stephen had handed me all the ammunition I needed. The house felt different when I came home. Violated somehow, like Stephen had already been through it with an appraiser's eye. I found evidence of his snooping everywhere. Drawers left slightly open, papers not quite in their original positions, even my jewelry box showing signs of investigation. He'd been cataloging my belongings like a vulture preparing for a feast. But Stephen had missed the most important thing entirely. While he'd been focused on obvious valuables, my grandmother's china, Robert's old tools, the antique furniture, he'd completely ignored the metal detector gathering dust in the basement. Robert had bought that detector 15 years ago during his brief treasure hunting phase. He'd spent weekends combing the property for Civil War artifacts and old coins, finding nothing but rusty nails and beer cans. I teased him about his expensive toy, never mentioning that I had my own use for it. Now, alone in my kitchen with the medical alert bracelet Stephen had insisted I wear, probably hoping it would summon an ambulance for my final moments, I retrieved Robert's detector and began the most important treasure hunt of my life. My first target was behind the old chicken coop, where I'd buried a waterproof case containing the original oil lease documents and approximately $50,000 in cash. The detector's steady beeping guided me to the exact spot, and within 20 minutes of digging, I was holding proof that Stephen had unknowingly sold property worth far more than he'd realized. The second site, near the apple orchard, yielded another case with gold coins, and the deed information showing the farm's true mineral rights value. The third, by the fence line, contained bank statements and legal documents proving the annual royalty payments I'd been receiving for years. By sunset, I had recovered 7 different caches, each containing evidence of wealth that Stephen had never suspected existed. The cash alone totaled nearly $300,000. The gold and silver added another $100,000. But the real treasure was the documentation proving that our worthless farm generated over $200,000 annually in mineral rights payments. Stephen thought he'd sold a rundown farm for $500,000, probably congratulating himself on getting such a good price for Mom's old place. He had no idea he'd just given away property generating that much income every 2 years with millions more in untapped oil reserves. But here's what made it truly delicious. The sale contract required the new owners to honor all existing mineral rights agreements. Stephen had signed away the property, but not the ongoing royalty payments, which legally belonged to whoever held the mineral rights documentation, and I held all of it. My phone rang as I was rearing the last case, keeping just the documents and some cash for immediate needs. Stephen's number flashed on the screen. "Hi, honey." I answered, making my voice sound appropriately weak. "Mom, I've been thinking about your comfort during this difficult time. Maybe we should look into hospice care. Make sure you have proper medical support." Translation: he wanted medical professionals to witness my decline and death, probably to avoid any questions about the convenient timing of the farm's sale. "That's thoughtful, Stephen, but I'm managing okay for now." "Well, I also wanted to discuss some practical matters. Making sure all your affairs are in order. Have you thought about where you'd like the funeral service? What kind of arrangements you prefer?" The man was actually planning my funeral while trying to sound caring. I had to admire his commitment to the performance. "Oh, I've got some ideas about that," I said. And for the first time in days I wasn't lying. "Don't worry, Stephen. Everything will be exactly as it should be." After hanging up, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in Kansas City, Stephen was probably celebrating his successful theft, maybe even calling Jessica to share the good news about his windfall. He had no idea that his dying mother was very much alive, very much angry, and now holding enough legal ammunition to destroy his life completely. The farm was gone, yes, but the real treasure had been right under his feet the whole time, and he'd been too greedy and impatient to realize it. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone reveal exactly who they are. Tomorrow, I'd begin phase 2 of my education program for my ungrateful son. Stephen arrived for his final visit with flowers and a funeral director's business card, hidden in his jacket pocket. I saw him slip it back when he thought I wasn't looking, the same way he'd been hiding his true nature for years. But today, I was ready to start pulling back the curtain on his performance. "You look tired, Mom," he said, settling into Robert's old chair with the confidence of someone who already considered himself the man of the house. "Are you sure you don't want me to arrange for some help? Maybe someone to stay with you?" "I'm fine for now, honey, though I have been thinking about what you said about getting my affairs in order." His eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "That's good, Mom. That's really good. Do you want me to call our attorney? Help you review your will?" "Actually, I've been remembering some things your father told me before he died about the property, about things he never got a chance to explain properly." Stephen leaned forward, trying to look concerned while practically salivating over potential new information about hidden assets. "What kind of things?" I let silence stretch between us, watching him fidget. Finally I spoke. "Stephen, when you sold the farm, did you happen to mention to the buyers that there might be other valuable items on the property?" "Other valuable items?" His voice cracked slightly. "Well, your father was always talking about contingency plans, emergency funds, things buried for safekeeping." I paused, studying his face. "I assume you told them about the possibilities when you negotiated the sale price." The color drained from Stephen's face as the implications hit him. If there was buried treasure on the property, and he hadn't disclosed it, the new owners would legally own whatever they found. He'd essentially given away unknown wealth along with the land. "Buried," he whispered. "What exactly did Dad bury?" "Oh, your father always worried about banks failing or the government taking everything. He converted quite a bit to cash and gold over the years. Said it was insurance for the family." I watched Stephen's hands begin to shake. "I can't remember exactly where he put everything. My memory isn't what it used to be." Stephen was doing rapid mental calculations, probably figuring out how much money he might have accidentally included in his theft. His greed was wearing with his panic, creating the most delicious internal conflict. "How much cash are we talking about, Mom?" "Oh, I couldn't say exactly. He handled all that, but he did mention once that it was enough to take care of us for the rest of our lives." I coughed delicately. "Of course, now that the property's sold, I suppose it belongs to the new owners." "Wait." Stephen stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Wait, we need to think about this. Maybe the sale isn't completely final yet. Maybe there's still time to renegotiate or add clauses about personal property." There it was, the exact reaction I'd been hoping for. Stephen was now frantically trying to figure out how to steal even more than he'd already stolen, which would require him to admit what he'd done. "I thought you said everything was finalized," I said innocently. "Well, yes, but there might be ways to modify the agreement, especially if there are material facts that weren't disclosed." He was thinking out loud now, too panicked to maintain his careful facade. "Mom, I need you to think carefully. Where might Dad have buried things? What did he tell you exactly?" "Stephen," I said, letting my voice carry just a hint of steel, "are you asking me to help you steal from the new property owners?" He froze, caught between his fake concern for his dying mother and his real concern for money he'd never legally owned. "No, of course not. I just meant if there are family assets on the property, we should make sure they're properly accounted for. Family assets that you included when you sold my property without my permission." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Stephen's carefully constructed story was beginning to crumble, and we both knew it. "Mom, I can explain." "Oh, I think you've explained quite enough for one day," I said, reaching for my phone. "I'm feeling very tired suddenly. Perhaps you should go home and think about exactly what you've done." Stephen left, looking like a man who just realized he might have thrown away a winning lottery ticket. But the best part was yet to come. Tomorrow I'd let him discover just how winning that ticket really was. The next morning brought exactly what I'd expected. Stephen's rental car in my driveway at sunrise, followed by the sight of my grown son digging holes in what used to be our backyard like a deranged treasure hunter. I watched from my kitchen window as he sweated through his expensive clothes, systematically destroying the landscaping I'd maintained for decades. He'd brought proper equipment this time: a shovel, a metal detector that looked suspiciously new, and what appeared to be a GPS device. Clearly, he'd spent the night planning his archaeological expedition into grand larceny. Around noon, when Stephen had managed to turn my once beautiful garden into something resembling a war zone, I strolled outside with a glass of iced tea and the performance of my life. "Stephen, honey, what on earth are you doing?" He straightened up, mud-covered and sweating, holding the shovel like he'd been caught gravedigging, which in a way he had been. "Mom, I thought maybe I could help you find some of Dad's things before." He gestured vaguely at my supposed impending death. "That's so thoughtful, dear. Any luck?" The desperation in his eyes was almost pitiful. "Not yet, Mom. I really need you to remember everything Dad told you. Every detail about where he might have put things." I pretended to think hard, occasionally touching my temple like someone struggling with failing memory. "Well, there was something about the old oak tree and maybe the area by the fence. Oh, and he spent a lot of time near the garden shed that last summer." Stephen nodded frantically, making mental notes of every location I mentioned. He had no idea I was sending him on a wild goose chase to areas where I'd never buried anything valuable. Also, I added, watching him hang on every word. He mentioned something about markers, special ways to remember the spots, but I could never make sense of his system. What kind of markers? Oh, coordinates, maybe? He was always writing down numbers in that little notebook of his. I paused dramatically. I think I still have it somewhere. Stephen actually dropped his shovel. "You have Dad's notebook?" "Possibly, though with my condition I'm not sure I could find it even if I tried." I sighed heavily. And even if I could, what would be the point? The property belongs to someone else now. That's when Stephen finally cracked completely. "Mom, I need to tell you something." He sat down heavily on my porch steps, looking like a man about to confess to murder. "The farm sale, it wasn't exactly handled the way it should have been." "What do you mean, honey?" "I mean, I may have expedited the process while you were in the hospital without getting your full approval first." The understatement was so massive it was almost impressive. "Expedited? How?" "I signed some papers on your behalf. I thought I was helping, but now I realize I should have waited. Should have discussed it with you first." Still not admitting to outright fraud, but closer to the truth than he'd ever come before. "Stephen," I said quietly, "are you telling me you sold my farm without my permission? I thought you were dying." The words exploded out of him. "The doctor said 6 months, maybe less. I thought I was handling things so you wouldn't have to worry about legal complications and probate fees and all that mess. So you decided to steal from me instead." "It wasn't stealing. It was poor timing. And now, if there's actually money buried on that property, I've made a terrible mistake." I let him sit with that admission for a long moment, watching him realize that he just confessed to fraud while begging me to help him commit more theft. "Stephen," I finally said, "there's something I need to tell you too." His head snapped up, hope and terror wearing in his expression. "The doctors made a mistake. I'm not dying. I don't have cancer. It was just an infection and I'm completely fine." The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear the wind moving through the corn in the neighboring field. Stephen's face went through about 15 different emotions before settling on a kind of numb horror. "You're not dying, not even a little bit, which means I'll be around for a very long time to deal with the consequences of what you've done." Stephen stood up slowly like a man in a dream or a nightmare. "Mom, I can fix this. I can make this right. Can you, Stephen? Can you really?" He opened his mouth to answer, then seemed to realize he had no idea how to undo the damage he'd caused. The farm was sold, the money spent or committed, and now his healthy, very much alive mother was staring at him with the kind of cold disappointment that would haunt him forever. But I wasn't done with my education program yet. Not even close. "Tell me, son," I said, my voice carrying 40 years of accumulated wisdom and recent fury. "Exactly how much did you get from my family's four-generation legacy?" And that's when Stephen learned that some questions don't have good answers. 500,000, Stephen whispered, and I watched 30 years of his carefully constructed self-image crumble in real time. "The buyers paid 500,000 for everything." I nodded slowly, doing the math in my head while maintaining my expression of disappointed calm. $500,000 for a property that generated $200,000 annually in mineral rights alone. Stephen had essentially sold a money printing machine for less than 3 years of its output. And how much of that money do you still have, Stephen? His silence told me everything I needed to know. The money was gone. Spent on debts, invested in something risky, or simply absorbed into his lifestyle so quickly he couldn't extract it even if he wanted to. Most of it went to paying off the house, he finally admitted. Jessica's been wanting to renovate the kitchen, and the boys need college funds, and I had some business investments that needed capital. Of course, Stephen had stolen my inheritance to fund his family's luxury lifestyle, probably justifying it as early inheritance while I was supposedly dying. Anyway, the calculation was as cold as it was stupid. Stephen, I said, walking closer to where he stood covered in mud and shame. Do you have any idea what you've actually done? I made a mistake. You committed fraud. You forged legal documents while I was medically incapacitated. You stole property that wasn't yours to take. My voice remained level, but each word hit him like a physical blow. But more than that, you threw away generational wealth because you were too greedy to wait for nature to take its course. Stephen's face was pale now, understanding dawning as he realized the magnitude of his error. What do you mean, generational wealth? I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single document. One of the mineral rights statements I'd recovered from my buried cash. Stephen's eyes widened as he read the numbers. This is just 1/4's royalty payment, I said calmly. There are 4 of these every year. And the oil company's geological survey suggests the reserves could last another 30 years or more. Stephen's knees actually buckled. He sat down hard on my porch steps, the document shaking in his hands. $6 million, he breathed. The mineral rights are worth $6 million minimum. We're worth $6 million, I corrected. Now they belong to whoever bought the property from you, along with the surface rights, the water rights, and everything else you signed away in your hurry to cash in on your supposedly dying mother. The sound Stephen made was somewhere between a sob and a scream. He just realized he'd traded a lifetime of wealth for a one-time payment that was already spent. It was like selling a golden goose for the price of a single egg. But Mom, he said desperately, the contract might have loopholes. Maybe we can challenge the sale. Maybe you should have thought about consequences before you committed fraud. Stephen looked up at me with eyes full of panic and desperate hope. You could help me fix this. You could say you weren't competent when you signed, that the medication made you confused. But I didn't sign anything, Stephen. You forged my signature, remember? The trap closed with an almost audible click. Stephen had just suggested that I lie to help him cover up his crimes while simultaneously admitting those crimes existed. Every word out of his mouth was digging his hole deeper. We're family, he whispered, playing his last card. Families help each other. I looked down at my son, this man I'd raised, fed, clothed, educated, and loved unconditionally for 42 years, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. You're right, Stephen. Families do help each other. They don't steal from each other while pretending to provide care. They don't forge documents or lie to lawyers or sell their mother's heritage for spending money. Stephen was crying now. Real tears of loss and terror. Not for me, not for the relationship he'd destroyed, but for the money he'd thrown away. What happens now? He asked. I smiled. And it wasn't a nice smile. Now you learn what consequences feel like. Miranda Hawthorne's law office felt like a temple to justice. All dark wood and legal precedents that had destroyed better men than Stephen. I sat across from her mahogany desk while she reviewed the evidence. I brought the forged documents, the hospital records proving my incapacitation during the sale, and most damaging of all, the recordings I'd made of Stephen's confessions. This is ironclad, Miranda said, setting down the last document. Criminal fraud, elder abuse, forgery. We could have him arrested today if you wanted. I don't want him arrested, I said, surprising her. I want something more educational. Miranda raised an eyebrow. Educational? Stephen thinks he's clever. He thinks he outsmarted his dying mother and got away with the perfect crime. I want him to understand exactly how wrong he is before we lower the boom. What did you have in mind? I outlined my plan while Miranda took notes, occasionally smiling at the more creative elements. When I finished, she sat back in her chair with obvious admiration. Mrs. Thompson, You have a delightfully twisted sense of justice. 42 years of raising Stephen taught me that some lessons require creativity. The next phase began immediately, and Miranda's investigators started documenting every aspect of Stephen's fraud, while I played the role of confused dying mother who suspected something was wrong, but couldn't quite figure out what. The beauty of the plan was that Stephen's own greed would provide most of the evidence we needed. His attempts to fix his mistake, the frantic phone calls to real estate lawyers, the desperate research into contract nullification, the increasingly bizarre schemes to reclaim mineral rights he'd already signed away. All of it created a digital trail of his consciousness of guilt. Meanwhile, I was supposedly growing weaker and more confused, occasionally letting slip details about other valuable items Stephen might have missed. I mentioned safe deposit boxes that probably didn't exist, insurance policies that might have lapsed, and investment accounts I couldn't quite remember. Each hint sent Stephen into frenzied research mode, desperately trying to find assets he could legitimately claim before his mother died. And everything went to probate. He had no idea that every phone call he made to banks and insurance companies was being documented by Miranda's team. The psychological pressure was exquisite to watch. Stephen lost weight, developed a nervous tic, and started snapping at Jessica and the boys. His perfect suburban life was cracking under the strain of knowing he'd destroyed his family's future through his own impatience and greed. 2 weeks into our campaign, Stephen made his first major mistake. Desperate to find more assets, he broke into my house while I was supposedly at a doctor's appointment, searching for the mythical notebook I'd mentioned. What he found instead was a hidden camera system Miranda had installed, recording his every move as he ransacked my bedroom, looking for financial documents that would tell him exactly how much wealth he'd thrown away. The video was devastating. Stephen rifling through my personal belongings, reading my medical records, even going through my prescription bottles looking for evidence of mental incapacitation he could use to justify his actions. He's building his defense, Miranda explained when she showed me the footage. He's trying to find evidence that you weren't competent when he forged your signature. Perfect, I said. Let him. Because what Stephen didn't know was that Dr. Morrison had already provided a sworn statement about my mental clarity during my hospitalization. The medical records clearly showed I was fully competent when Stephen committed his fraud, making his current search for contrary evidence another form of obstruction of justice. Stephen was building a case against himself, one crime at a time. The final piece fell into place when Stephen, in his desperation, approached the people who bought the farm. He offered to buy back just the mineral rights, claiming there had been a family misunderstanding about what was included in the sale. The buyers naturally told him where he could stick his offer. But more importantly, they recorded the conversation and contacted their own lawyer, concerned that they might be caught up in some kind of fraud scheme. That's when the beautiful irony of Stephen's situation became complete. In trying to undo his theft, he'd actually confirmed it to multiple witnesses while creating evidence of his guilty knowledge. Stephen had outsmarted himself so thoroughly that even I was impressed. The confrontation I'd been planning for weeks finally came on a Thursday morning when Stephen arrived at my house with a moving truck and 2 men who looked like professional furniture movers. He'd clearly decided that if he couldn't reclaim the farm, he'd salvage whatever other assets he could find. "Mom," he said, trying to project authority while his voice shook with barely controlled panic. "I've arranged for some help moving you to a nice assisted living facility, somewhere you'll be more comfortable during your final weeks." I looked past him at the moving truck, understanding immediately what was happening. Stephen was going to empty my house of anything valuable, claim it was necessary for my care, and probably sell most of it to recoup some of his losses. "That's thoughtful, honey, but I'm quite comfortable here. The doctors think supervised care would be better for you," he lied smoothly. "And honestly, this old house is too much for you to maintain." The 2 movers stood behind him, looking uncomfortable, probably sensing they were being used in some kind of family dispute they wanted no part of. "Stephen," I said calmly, "are you planning to steal my furniture too?" His mask slipped completely. "I'm not stealing anything. I'm trying to take care of you, and part of that means liquidating assets to pay for your care. Assets like my grandmother's china, my jewelry, the antique furniture that's been in this family for generations." "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. The cancer is affecting your judgment." That's when I played my final card. "Stephen, I don't have cancer. The words hit him like a physical blow. Behind him, the two movers exchanged glances and started backing toward their truck, recognizing the sound of a family situation about to explode. What? The diagnosis was wrong. I've been healthy for weeks now, which means I'm going to live long enough to see exactly what kind of person you really are. Stephen's face went through a rapid sequence of emotions. Confusion, hope, fear, and finally calculation. I could almost see him trying to figure out if this changed anything about his plans. That's wonderful news, Mom. But you're still getting older, and maybe it would be good to simplify your living situation anyway. He was actually trying to continue his theft, even after learning I wasn't dying. The audacity was breathtaking. Stephen, I said, pulling out my phone. I'd like you to meet someone. Miranda Hawthorne stepped out from behind the moving truck where she'd been waiting with a sheriff's deputy and a court order. The deputy was holding what looked like an arrest warrant. Stephen Thompson? The deputy asked. Yes, you're under arrest for fraud, elder abuse, and forgery. The next few minutes were a masterpiece of justice in action. As the deputy read Stephen his rights, Miranda served him with civil papers demanding the return of all proceeds from the fraudulent farm sale. The movers disappeared so quickly they might have been a mirage. But the most beautiful moment came when Stephen, handcuffed and facing the destruction of everything he'd thought he'd gained, turned to me with desperate eyes. Mom, please. I'm your son. I made a mistake. But we can fix this. Family forgives family. I looked at this man who'd raised lying to an art form, who'd stolen from his supposedly dying mother without a trace of conscience, who'd been willing to commit additional crimes to cover up his original theft. Stephen, I said quietly, you stopped being my son the moment you forged my signature. Now you're just a criminal who happens to share my DNA. The deputy led him away while Miranda and I watched from my porch. After the cars disappeared down my driveway, she turned to me with a satisfied smile. How does justice feel, Mrs. Thompson? I considered the question while looking out over the land that was no longer mine, thinking about the family legacy that had been traded for Stephen's mortgage payments and kitchen renovation. It feels like the first day of the rest of my life, I said. And for the first time in months that felt like enough. 6 months later, I stood in the courtroom watching Stephen learn the true cost of his betrayal. The judge had just sentenced him to 2 years in federal prison for elder fraud, plus restitution of the full amount he'd stolen. Money he no longer had and couldn't possibly repay. Jessica had filed for divorce 3 months ago, taking the boys and half of everything Stephen owned, which wasn't much after the lawyer's fees and legal settlements. The house they'd renovated with my stolen money was in foreclosure. Stephen's business partnership had dissolved when news of his criminal conviction made headlines. In trying to secure his family's financial future, Stephen had destroyed it completely. But the Swedish justice came from an unexpected source. The oil company that leased our mineral rights had been monitoring the ownership transfer. And when they learned about the fraud, they'd invoked a clause in their contract that voided any agreements made through illegal means. The mineral rights reverted to the last legitimate owner, me. I'd gotten my treasure back without spending a penny on lawyers or private investigators. Stephen's greed had been so obvious, so thoroughly documented that the legal system had essentially prosecuted itself. Standing there watching my son shuffle out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not for his situation. He'd earned every consequence, but for the man he'd chosen to become. The Stephen I'd raised would have been horrified by these crimes. That boy had helped me with farm chores, brought me flowers on Mother's Day, called me every week during college just to check in. Somewhere along the way, that child had been replaced by a stranger who saw family relationships as business transactions. After the sentencing, Miranda and I sat in her car outside the courthouse while she reviewed the final financial settlements. The house will sell for enough to cover most of the restitution. She said Stephen's business assets will cover the rest. You should receive full compensation within 60 days. And the mineral rights completely restored. The oil company has already resumed payments to your account. She smiled. Congratulations, Mrs. Thompson. You're officially a millionaire. I laughed, surprising both of us. At 68 years old, I'm finally rich enough to do whatever I want. What will you do? I've been thinking about that question for months. The farm was gone, sold to buyers who'd made it clear they weren't interested in selling back. My house felt empty without the family memories that had once filled it. Stephen's betrayal had changed everything about my life. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. I think I'll travel, I said finally. See the places Robert and I always talked about visiting someday. Maybe buy a little house by the ocean where Stephen will never think to look for me. You're going to disappear. I'm going to live. For the first time in 40 years, I'm going to live exactly the life I want with exactly the people I choose to include in it. Miranda nodded approvingly. Stephen will probably try to contact you when he gets out of prison. Let him try. I'll be somewhere he can't find me, living under a name he doesn't know. With money he'll never see. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching regular people go about their regular lives, unaware that justice had just been served in the building behind us. Mrs. Thompson, Miranda said finally, I've been practicing law for 20 years, and I've never seen someone handle betrayal with such strategic brilliance. You should write a book. I smiled, thinking about all the buried secrets I'd never share. All the pain I'd transformed into power. All the lessons I'd learned about the difference between family and loyalty. Maybe I will, I said, though I think I'll change the names to protect the guilty. 2 years after Stephen's sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through 3 different addresses to reach my new home in coastal Maine. The handwriting was familiar, but somehow diminished, like its author had aged decades in the time he'd been away. Dear Mom, it began, and I almost threw it away without reading further. But curiosity won out over wisdom, and I found myself drawn into Stephen's final attempt at manipulation. He'd learned about redemption and family forgiveness in prison. He wrote. He understood now how wrong he'd been, how his actions had destroyed not just my trust, but his own children's respect. He wanted a chance to make amends, to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The letter was beautifully written, full of the kind of psychological insights that suggested either genuine growth or very good coaching from someone who understood manipulation. Given Stephen's history, I knew which was more likely. I set the letter aside and walked out onto my deck overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. My little house in Bar Harbor was everything I dreamed of. Cozy, private, and completely mine. The mineral rights payments had allowed me to buy it outright, along with a new car and enough invested money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I'd made new friends here, people who knew me as Margaret Collins, a widow who'd moved to Maine for the ocean air and small-town community. They had no idea about Stephen or the farm or the millions of dollars in my carefully managed investment accounts. For the first time in my adult life, I was exactly who I chose to be, not who someone else needed me to be. The phone rang as I was watching fishing boats return to harbor with their daily catch. The caller ID showed Jessica's number, which surprised me. Stephen's ex-wife and I hadn't spoken since the trial. Margaret, she said when I answered, using the name I changed to legally after moving. I hope I'm not bothering you. Hello, Jessica. How are the boys? They're good, growing up fast. Actually, that's why I'm calling. She paused and I could hear nervousness in her voice. Tommy asks about you sometimes, about his grandmother. I know things ended badly with Stephen, but the boys are innocent. I finished for her. Exactly. I wouldn't blame you if you said no, but if you ever wanted to see them, maybe write to them occasionally. I think it would mean a lot to them. I closed my eyes, thinking about my grandsons, who'd become casualties of their father's greed. They'd lost not just their grandmother, but their understanding of family itself when Stephen's crimes came to light. I'd like that, I said finally. Very much. There's something else, Jessica continued. Stephen gets out next month. He's been asking me for your contact information, wanting to reach out to you. I haven't given him anything, but I thought you should know he's looking. Thank you for the warning. After hanging up, I sat on my deck thinking about second chances and the difference between forgiveness and foolishness. Stephen could spend the rest of his life trying to find me, trying to convince me that he'd changed, trying to access whatever wealth he thought I might still possess, but he'd never find Margaret Collins in her oceanside retirement. That woman was beyond his reach, protected by distance and legal barriers and the hard-won wisdom that came from learning the difference between love and manipulation. I pulled out my phone and deleted Stephen's letter without reading it again. Then I opened my email and started typing a message to Jessica about visiting the boys during their upcoming spring break. Some relationships were worth salvaging. Others were better left buried. Like the secrets I'd once hidden in an Illinois farmyard. As the sun set over the Maine coast, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. I felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life finally lived on my own terms. Stephen had tried to steal my legacy, but he'd actually given me something more valuable: the freedom to write a completely new story. And this time I was the only author who mattered. The ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, and I sat in my own home on my own deck, living my own life, finally understanding what freedom really meant. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.